Our next program we'll have here, October the 15th, of 101st Day One Veteran. It's the third Tuesday in October. This program is entitled Gladiator Field Artillery in Europe during World War II. In November, we will have a man that was in the anti-aircraft during World War II in Europe. His name's Harry Blank, and that's November the 19th. And in December, we'll have an 8th Air Force veteran speak here. He will present film that is shot out of his B-17 during World War II, and he will have his book for sale. It's called Hell from Heaven. It's memoirs and diary kept of his time in the 8th Air Force. There's a program like this one at Doylestown Library on 150 South Pine Street. And this month, September the 25th, which is the last Wednesday of the month, they're going to have Harvey Seals, who was an Army veteran of World War II in Korea. In October the 23rd, they'll have a man that was a captain in Vietnam. His name's John DeLong. And in November, they're going to have Tom Morrison speak, who's speaking here in October. So if you missed the program here in October, you can see him speak in Doylestown in November. And if you need directions, you can contact the coordinator to the library. We have programs here at 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. the third Tuesday of each month. Is anyone here for the first time? Well, thank you for coming. And if you haven't done already, on your way out, please circle next to your name if you'd like to come to the next two lectures. Circle 3 p.m. or 7 p.m. And donations also. They never hurt. And thanks to a couple of people, Charlotte Gerlach and John France, you can read about the Abington World War II lecture series in some papers, the Glenside Life, Glenside News, Philadelphia Neighbors column, Philly News, and the Times Chronicle. And I put a thank you note in here. I wanted to thank a couple of people who guarded the World War II Jeep and Cannon, which was outside the library last lecture. And some of them aren't here, but I'll read the names anyway. Len Packman, Brad Kidall, John McFadden, Tony Zenzinger, Barbara Clark, Robert Clark, Ed Butcher, George Hinckley, Tom Cameron, Betty Jean Miller, Bob Miller, Doris Copeland, Jerry Copeland, all volunteered their time to guard the World War II Jeep and Cannon. We're going to begin selling videotapes of the lectures this winter, and we'll have lists of all the past lectures. All we ask is a $20 donation to the library. And we're trying to start a program like this one at the Glenside VFW, and we hope to have it running this winter. And we'll have more information about that in our next newsletter. And put a preview of next year's programs here at the library that we're going to have. I'll read a couple. We're going to have Pennsylvania National Guard in World War II, the Merchant Marine in World War II. Off-Log 64 was a POW camp for Army officers. We're having a combat medic come and speak here. He was in the 3rd Army during World War II, 5th Division. We'll have some veterans from the USS New Jersey come in, give a speech what it was like to serve aboard in New Jersey in World War II. We're going to have a survivor of the SS Leopoldville, which was sunk on Christmas Eve, 1944. And he was also liberated at Dachau, and he'll speak here next year. We'll have another 8th Air Force veteran who was an internee of the Swedes. We will have a fighter pilot who was in the 9th Air Force during World War II. A man that was in the 6th Marine Division in the last battle of World War II, the Battle of Okinawa. We're going to have the 10th Mountain Division, some of the ski troops, the only ski troops in the United States Army, 10th Mountain Division, will come here and speak. And we're going to have the African American soldiers of World War II, Buffalo soldiers, come in and speak. So those are some things to look forward to next year. And I put information about our website on here, the web address. We're going to have a list of future programs and past programs, as well as transcripts from programs, photographs, and video clips. Before I introduce you, Walter West, would you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Just testing, everybody hear me all the way back? Okay. Before I begin the prepared part, let me just ask, how many of you here tonight were in Greenland during World War II? No one, right? Okay, well then I can tell you anything I want. And it's believable. And also, those of us that were in World War II military service, as you know, there were over 12 million of us. And I know you all know about when you went into service. And have you ever given any thought to who was the last person discharged from World War II military service? Buddy, it was me. Just thought you ought to know that. And just a little bit of record, and believe me, on a very serious note, I really feel embarrassed being up here talking about my World War II service, because when I compare it with what a lot of you did in the active combat role, my hat is off to you, and I'm humbly grateful. Mine was a far cry from what you fellas and maybe gals went through. I enlisted in the Army Air Force's inactive reserve while a student at Lehigh in December '42. And we were called as a group to active duty in February '43. I had applied for the pre-meteorology program with academics for a year with the idea of becoming a weather cadet. And then somewhere along the line between then and when we graduated from our program in May of '44, the Army Air Forces realized they were not going to need 12,000 weather forecasters, so they terminated the continuation of the program. And in June of '44, a month later, I was reassigned as a weather observer in training. So while some of you I know personally by now were busy doing other things, on June 6, 1944, I was starting 2 months of weather observer training at Westover Field, Massachusetts. Then following that, I was selected to be a part of the upper air ray wind training program. And ray wind stands for radio winds aloft, upper air. And we were going to be operating and maintaining equipment after we graduated. So by June of '45 rather, I had completed this training, and I was qualified and ready for upper air weather station duty, probably somewhere in the world in a remote place. That's all we knew at that time. And we were going to be self-contained, maintain the equipment. And on June 14th then in '45, and keep in mind the war in Europe had ended by this time, I reported to Grenier Field, New Hampshire, headquarters of the 8th Weather Squadron, serving the North Atlantic and Europe. So at least my feelings of where I was ultimately going to end up were getting sort of localized. Well, when I reported there, I met a classmate of mine who had arrived the day before, he told me, and he said, "Congratulations, Walt, good luck." He said, "I know where you're going." And I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yeah, I got here yesterday," and he said, "I was told that there were 2 spots available. One was in Bermuda, and one was in Greenland. Guess where I'm going?" So next day at headquarters, I reported, of course, and they told me I was going to Walrus Bay, Greenland. "Where's that?" I asked. And they answered, 300 miles above the Arctic Circle, near the village of Scoresby-Sund, population 100. And I said, "Where's that?" And they said, "It's in the high Arctic, on the northeast coast of Greenland." And I said, "What's there?" And they said, "It's an isolated weather outpost with we're going to have 11 men. They had 14, for the year before. You'll be there for 1 year, and our ships can get through the ice pack only in late August, if they're lucky. So your crew is going to relieve the present crew who had established the station in August of '44. So that cut out my leave time home and so on. And furthermore, they told me I had to be on a supply transport from the main base in southern Greenland by the first week of July, because it was leaving then. So all of you know about Army processing, and in a couple of days I was through Grenier Field on my way up to the Army Air Force base at Presque Isle, Maine, northern Maine. And if any of you have ever ridden the Bangor and the Aroostook Railroad for about 12, 15 hours, it's an interesting experience. I don't think it's there anymore. But so by further processing, by June 27th, I was flying to Greenland on a 4-engine Army Air Forces Transport Command C-54, not bucket seats, passenger seats. I was going in style. And we went via Goose Bay, Labrador. And, okay, Don, lights down.
Did you get that ready?
Are the ones in the rear of the room?
Yeah, I'll get that.
Okay, I'll turn it on meanwhile. Allow me logistics here. Okay, on my way to Greenland. Greenland also has been called the White War and the Quiet War. Now, not too many people know what happened up there during the war. Let me just orient you a little bit. I'm coming here to the main base in southwestern Greenland called BW1, Bluey West 1, Narsarsuaq. There were a few more bases, Air Force bases, along the west coast, along the Arctic Circle, Sandrestrom Fjord, Bluey West 8. And on the east, and there's on the east coast there were just 2 locations: Ekatek, near the village of Agmasalik, BE2, Bluey East 2, right just south of the Arctic Circle, and our location. No airstrip, no nothing, had to get in and out by ship, and Scoresby Sund. Walrus Bay was about 1.5 miles from Scoresby Sund. And the reason there aren't many bases along the east coast is, as you'll see some pictures, the mountains come precipitously down right into the ocean or the ice. There's very few flat strips where they can either build a strip or put settlements, for that matter. Reykjavik, Iceland is here, so that's Iceland.
Is that out of the port?
And at the time of the war, the population of Greenlanders in Greenland was 16,000. I'll distinguish between Greenlanders, who are native, and Eskimos. Eskimos are full-blooded, and thanks to the Danish influence, there's some mixed blood, and they are Greenlanders. So the Greenlanders are very proud of the fact that they have white blood in them. Well, the population now of Greenland, by the way, is about 55,000. So with good health care and so on, it's just going there. And the area of Greenland, it's equal to about half of the United States from the Mississippi River east to the Atlantic Ocean. And north and south, about from Florida up to Maine. That gives you an idea of the coverage. Now, a little bit of background is the military activity. And by the way, the reason the military wanted, well, airstrips, naturally, it was an emergency and military point on the flights to Europe, but also for weather data. That's why the Army Air Force established so many weather stations, because the Greenland air mass, the Arctic air mass, affects the weather of the North Atlantic and Europe. And a lot of you that landed in Normandy and other operations in Europe, a lot of the weather forecasts were based on weather station data coming out of Greenland. The Germans also knew the value of weather data. And in 1943, they established a weather station themselves up at Eskimonis, about 200-300 miles north of Scoresby Sund. The Danish Sledge Patrol, it wasn't formed then yet, but some native hunters found this site, reported it back to Scoresby Sund. The Army and the Coast Guard and the Air Force all got involved in wiping out that station. And in part of the confusion and everything, Ib Poulsen, the captain of the Danish Sledge Patrol, was captured by the Germans. He in turn overpowered his captor, Captain Ritter, and made it himself. And those of you that like to hike and so on, or used to, Ib Poulsen hiked, without the benefit of full Arctic weather clothing and all, about 200 miles on foot down to Scoresby Sund. So he was quite a legend in the Danish Army. I met Ib Poulsen not only when we took over the station as they were preparing to leave, because by then the war was over, but also I met him 40 years later in Copenhagen in his home. And I might add that Walrus Bay Weather Station was the northernmost Army base, military base really, during World War II. So we were the northern flank of all the 12 million men of you. Well, Greenland is not green, because Eric the Red wanted to settle it back in the year 1000, and he was a good realtor, and he encouraged people to colonize the southern part. Here's a view that I took on one of the trips to and from Europe back in '83, and Greenland for the most part is ice cap, glaciers, snow, or rocks and tundra in the summertime. The ground is rough where we were. It was permanently frozen with permafrost from 2 feet down. So therefore, any buildings built were not built on foundations. Our buildings rested on rocks. Now, here's a view globe-wise, and where we were, you can see that Walrus Bay was not the top of the world, but we felt we could almost see it from there. And you can get a picture of I'll explain about the Gulf Stream and how it moderated the temperatures and all later. There's a map, a little bit of the Scoresby Sund area coming up from Reykjavik. Scoresby Sund, our weather station, about 1.5 miles from there. And up Scoresby Sound, I'll be mentioning and showing you some pictures of Gearholm, which is a large hunter's cabin then. And another one I'll show you up the coast, another hunter's cabin. Well, flying in, this is actually an Army Signal Corps photo, but this is a typical view of fjords in Greenland. And this is a pilot's eye view coming up the fjord to the main base at BW1, or Sarsawak. And he didn't dare vary right or left too far because it would be a quick one-way trip if he had. But this is typical of the fjord system. Well, a week of processing, and by July 4th, I was on that Army transport, Belle Isle, and it was a small one, about 250 Army troops plus crew. And I was there with my future station members-to-be and some of the engineers who were to repair the winter storm damage and resupply us for the coming year. 5 days to Iceland, across the North Atlantic, and then we waited over 2 weeks for the ice pack to weaken so we could get into Scoresby Sund. finally on July 27th, we were underway. And through the ice pack and led by an icebreaker, the stores, slowly and extremely carefully. And on July 29th, we anchored off Walrus Bay, Greenland, our weather station. And here's a picture I obtained in 1986. So the village here is now 500 people, so considerably larger than when we were there. But here is the site of our weather station, right along this flat piece of ground. And that ground wasn't big enough for an airstrip, and I doubt if they would have built one then anyway, but that's where we were. And my first impression was, my God, what a God-forsaken place, and only one more year to go. So we're underway. Well, very quickly, the Army engineers got us unloading at the beach and repairing storm damage, including putting a new roof on our operations building, which had blown away the year before. And date-wise, during the first week that we're working, and we had already taken over the station duties from the previous crew, and the A-bomb dropped on August the 7th, as we well remember. Now, I know a lot of you in different combat areas and all, you all celebrated different ways, and we shot off a couple of rounds from our carbines, and that was about it. But by August the 13th, 1 week later, the ships were leaving. So we were on our own. But we knew that the end of the war was near, so what's going to happen to us? I might add, we were all High Point men. Had a couple of men that were eligible for discharge immediately under the point system, and I was one of the those that could have got out, should have got out, say by January of '46. Well, by September then, we know that the war did end, this armistice on the Missouri, and we understand later that the Army, Air Forces, and the Coast Guard did consider ways to get us out. One of the plans that they confided in us, this was later when we got home. Remember some of the pictures you've seen of mail sacks between two posts, and an airplane comes down with an arrestor gear, yanks the mail sack up and away? They considered that for us, one at a time. And in a way, I think we were very happy that we didn't have to try that, because it had never really been tried with a human being before. But anyway, they got us out, and a year later. So we got the message, fellas, sorry, the ice, and believe me, the first week in September, the fjord's already covered over with ice, and it thickens, and you just can't get an icebreaker in. So that couple of weeks in August is the only time available. Well, home for a year. Let me point out, we had 6 radio towers, 75 feet high, 3 for transmitting, 3 for receiving. Rhombic design, if any of you are into that. I don't even know if that's used anymore. I decided to climb one of the towers to get an overview of the area. And I have to admit, I got up as far as about 50 feet up and chickened out. I didn't feel like going any higher to 75 feet. And the sway, and I was getting tired, and the wind was picking up. So I took this picture, and let me orient you. That's our operations building, the work center, and the day room, rec hall, and kitchen at this end, our barracks for 11 men, our food warehouse, a garage which we didn't use, and the maintenance and transmitter equipment back here. They're separated by at least 50 to 100 feet in case of fire. So if one building goes, and we were oil stove heated, so in case one building went, we didn't lose anything else. 2 more important buildings, it doesn't show here, but the hydrogen generating shack. It had to be separate as far from the other buildings as possible, because naturally hydrogen can get pretty messy. And the other very important building was the outhouse. Now, our outhouse had a very careful history. The first one that was there blew away during one of the early storms because it wasn't anchored down, and luckily nobody was in it. So it end over end toward the fjord. So we brought it back and set it up and put an oil stove in it, and that burnt down a few months later, just as we're getting into the winter. And anyway, the rest of the winter we had to go Cold John's to get comfortable. Some of the men, there were different routines. Cheese if you want to keep yourself from going, and prunes if you felt it was time to go. So now that was for number 2 only. If you wanted number 1, we didn't have latrine trenches because there's no percolation, and with the tundra, permafrost, it wouldn't go anywhere. So we just number 1 on the ground. And we had to be careful during the windy or breezy days because you have to go back into it, and sometimes the wind would turn around. And I won't go into detail. You know that. So here we are, a good-looking group of men then. That's me, the others. We were various experiences and backgrounds. Some had been in the Arctic before. One of the men had just come out of Samoa, and so he was really geared for Arctic duty. Only 3 of us are now alive, and I've been in touch with them infrequently, and a couple of the widows. But there was one weatherman, weather observer, cross-trained as a radio operator. And by radio operator, I mean dots and dashes, Morse code. There were 2 radio operators cross-trained as weather observers. There was 1 medic, 1 cook, and 4 of us were upper air. That's radio sonde and raywind. The radio sonde are the original upper air, and temperature and humidity, and that's about it as the balloon goes up. The radio winds, we would have a directional antenna, and direction and azimuth or altitude. And I might add that there were no officers. We ranged from the 2 master sergeants, 1 in charge, signal corps in charge of maintenance and the transmitters, and 1 in the charge of weather. That's McLean weather and Kelso maintenance. And some people have asked me over the years, how did you ever, with 11 enlisted men, how did you manage the station if you didn't have any officers? I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here. My answer always was, very well. And actually, the crew the year before us, because it was a wartime situation in the first year of station operation, and because of the threat of German activity up the line, there was a weather officer, a first lieutenant, and they tell me that when the ship sailed away, he took his bars off and put them in his pocket and said, "Men, forget the bars until that ship comes back." And for obvious reasons, he would have been awfully alone for the year if everybody was cognizant of his station. So he was one of the men, and like we did, like they did, they talked things over. It was a truly democratic Army organization, if any of you fellows can believe it, but it was. All right, a couple of views of the station. That's one from the west looking. Oh, that mountain, by the way, is the closest one. It's about half a mile from our site, and it's about 1,500 feet high. We called it appropriately Sugarloaf Mountain. That's a view I took from about 100 yards up Sugarloaf Mountain of the station looking toward the west. That's 3 of us in the proper, whatever you like, winter garb. That's me on the left if you're interested. We didn't use snowshoes too often. They collected the snow and got heavy, and you had to trail them. Okay, what the well-dressed skier would wear. and behind the beard is me. Station duties. Looking at the weather readings in the instrument box, 8-hour shifts, every hour, surface temperature, humidity, surface winds, and cloud cover, traditional weather observations. There's the part of the radio sound equipment back there. You can't really get a good view of it. And the weather observer's desk. That's the desk in front of all the pinup pictures. And we did this all the time. This is me at just across the room preparing equipment for the upper air run. And a bed, not for sleeping on the job, believe me. Sometimes in the winter when the winds hit, you literally could not leave any building. So we might, wherever we were, we might be there. So for taking cat naps and all. Another picture of the stove and all. That's me getting ready to release a balloon with our equipment right here. Now this balloon, as you can see, hydrogen filled, about 5 feet in diameter. We made our own hydrogen. Anybody here had any experience making hydrogen? Very carefully. And that's why the building was separated. Caustic soda and a couple of other ingredients, 5 gallons of water that we had to lug there. And had to get the cap screwed on fast, because if you didn't, the pressure would build up. Strip the threads and don't be in front of it. And in the cold weather with heavy mittens and all, you get very alert. But by the time that balloon would reach the objective altitude of about 50 to 60,000 feet, that's about the size of this room. And then it breaks ultimately, and that's the end of the balloon run. In real cold weather or uncomfortable weather, we were praying that damn balloon would break at 30,000 or 40, but true to the traditions of the spirit, you know, we hung in there, right? All right, this is our ray wind mount, and just a quick technical description. It had a oscilloscope in there, and 4 bays, and they would alternate, and that's how we could determine where the radio transmitter was attached to the balloon, so we could track it. Now, a couple of things happened when they were shipping the equipment to us. Number one, the Army forgot to provide the shelter that we should have. So we had to be outside all year. They finally brought the shelter up when we were leaving the station, obviously. They somehow lost the leg mounts, so they had to be improvised by the engineers. But that was it. So now in the winter time, the snow built up. This is early in the winter. I have another picture. It would build up to the top of the mount that we had horizontal. But we had to shovel out before just about every run during the winter time. In the summertime, we would walk across this rock-strewn creek bed, telephone poles. That's our mount out here. And winter time, it's a little cleaner, but same route, same poles. And then every 4 hours, the radio we'd make the encode for weather data and sent down the coast to the nearest site at Icatec, which I mentioned. If they couldn't get in there for atmospheric conditions, then it would be across Greenland to the ice cap to the west coast sites. If they couldn't get there, they tried Reykjavik. It was hunt and find, trying to get good radio reception. Now, add to that during the winter in the Arctic, with a magnetic effect, we were near the magnetic North Pole, magnetic North Pole, the radio blackouts. And they could last anywhere from a couple of days to maybe a couple of weeks. And in that case, nothing went out and nothing came in. So we were literally cut off from the world. And this was our everyday duty. Every hour, every 4 hour transmitting, balloon runs when we could, when the winds got to be 30 miles an hour or higher on the ground, we could not release the big balloons. Just couldn't handle them. But the 7 days a week, that was what we were there for, and that's what we had to do. Other station duties: oil for the stoves, pump it out of the storage drums into holding tanks, bring them back into the smaller drums for distribution to each building. And in the wintertime, we got our buildings up to about 50 degrees, but there's no wind. If there was wind, we found out the hard way that the flue, would backfire and soot all over the place. You talk about a cleaning job. But so we learned during winds above, say, 50 miles an hour, which were frequent, turn them off. And it wasn't too bad. The buildings got down to 0 degrees, but we learned to live with it. We were dressed for it, obviously. The other important duty that had to be taken care of was water detail. Nearby lake, about a half a mile away, we'd go first with the snow jeep and then later with dog teams, because the snow jeep stopped working when it got too cold. And this was before the days of real scientific knowledge that had to be learned the hard way, that mechanized equipment just doesn't work in cold weather unless it's really specially prepared. But from the lake, by buckets into the garbage cans, used just for water, brought back to the holding tank for water right off the kitchen. Again, in, out, and so on. And in the summer, naturally, it wasn't bad. And during the winter, when the temperatures were below freezing, we would all, working this, would get covered with ice up to 1/4 inch. But we got through it, and we needed the water. Well, when we could, you'll see this truck later, but the 4x4 worked very well for various duties, including transporting water. What do we do in our spare time? Well, the rec room, right off the kitchen. So we had a lot of paperback books. You all remember them. Had a supply of 78 RPM records. You'll remember them. Games like chess, checkers, pinochle, no bridge players, darts, and a couple of our fellows who were self-appointed expert barroom dart throwers from back home asked our couple of young teenage Greenlander boys who were our Keefok or servants doing odd jobs around the place. Want us to show you how to throw darts? And one kid, okay, so he picks up the darts, every one from about 10 feet right into the bullseye. Well, they're taught at an early age. They don't do it now. Harpooning. Their lives and the feet of their families would depend on it. So that's the last time our guys showed them how. Ping pong, well, that was good. The game room wasn't that big, so he who had the fastest smash could usually win. But then the balls started to break, and more broke, and we played with crack balls and so on. So finally, that didn't last a year. Monopoly, we played that 2 or 3 times a night, and I mean an 8-hour night. And the Arctic, you lose all time of daylight and darkness, and I'll show you why in a minute. But that was a good game. We had movies, a 16mm movie projector. Started the year with 5 feature films, and ended the year with mail drops. We got up to about 20. And Gunga Din was our favorite, and we showed that about 16 times. Now these films have been shown by the special services people all over the world, and every week. And many times we always had to watch the take-up reel because we'd end up with a pile of film on the floor and had to rewind it very carefully. All right, cleanliness is next to godliness. That's our wash basin routine. Now I know you fellows that have been in the infantry would marvel at this, but that's our basin, and here's each one of us had a basin, and this is our daily cleansing, if you will. And when we're done with the wash water, we would take it to the rear door off the kitchen, throw it out on the ground. We could not have drainage pipes because anything in them would freeze during the winter. So we had to hope that nobody was coming into the door. But that was our method of washing, and the only running water in the place, obviously. Washing machine, an old Easy, if you can notice it. And another very important piece of equipment, our Saturday night bath water. And once a night. Now this is an Arctic night, and don't forget the Arctic nights are 6 months long. So needless to say, and that's near the cook stove, because we didn't want to wash where it wasn't a little bit of warm air. You don't perspire too much in the Arctic, even with long underwear on, so we might wash our clothes every few months, and ourselves as long as the other fellow's noses allowed. And this was our existence. We had to get along with each other with very little new news from the outside world to expand our conversational range. And fortunately, the 11 of us had few arguments. And the topics of conversation usually centered around the balloon runs, ours, and kidding us if we didn't get up to at least 30,000 feet, and we would brag if we got higher. The monthly parties over in the village, maybe, or when we invited them over for movies. And the girls of the village, naturally, you know what I mean. The sled dogs and what their personalities were, and believe me, every dog on the 8 dogs were different. We inherited the Danish Sledge Patrol team, so they were a good-looking set of dogs. And the reason they gave them to us is they were clearing out that if we had not taken them, they would have shot them, because they would not turn them over to the villagers. We had different treatment, code of ethics with their dogs. The male planes, where are they, and so on. And naturally, the girls back home, both steadies and conclaves. And as time drew nearer in July of 46, where's that relief ship? And so on, all sorts of conjecture and rumors. But a big help, we never had to complain about the food or our cook. The food was good, and the cook was capable. Now, in August of 45, just a couple of weeks after we got up there, I was lucky to have my name drawn out of a hat, because McLean, our non-com in charge of weather, and one other, that turned out to be me, we went up the fjord to Gearholm, I mentioned to you, to pick up some leftover weather equipment that the crew the year before us had left. They opened up a distant weather station to see if it was worth another set of weather data. It didn't work out, so we had to retrieve the weather instruments. I actually took this picture in '86 on a trip there with my wife. Not to this is down in the Massilic on the Arctic Circle area. But you see one fjord, an iceberg, you see them all right. So that's the way they form, coming off glaciers off the ice cap. Some of these are the size of a city block, and maybe 10 stories high. They're big, and you don't get near them, because if they change their equilibrium from pieces dropping off, the whole bird can change balance, and the waves generated and all. Okay, here near Gearholm, or at Gearholm, we found out that the natives, for the 6 natives, this was not a trip to retrieve weather instruments. This was a hunting trip for them to get food for the village, for their families. And they agreed that we'd come along. We didn't know that when we started, so we didn't have much food with us and so on. But anyway, here's a native Greenlander then, and all this is 1945 era. Camouflage sails so that they could get up close to a seal or narwhal and harpoon it. Attached to the business end of the harpoon is a breakable seal cord to sealskin floats. And the reason is when the wounded seal or narwhal dives, when it's been wounded, they can go down to the bottom of the fjord about a half-mile down. And when it surfaces, it can be anywhere a couple miles away maybe.
Wow.
And the natives get better visibility, obviously, as you can see, with the sealskin floats than they can looking for a small target. Well, anyway, that's a narwhal. That's a male narwhal.
Wow.
And it's about 15 feet long, a lot of skin and blubber on there. And we resorted at one later in the week to having to eat blubber. Anybody here ever eat blubber? I don't recommend it. It's like an inner tube, and you chew it and chew it and chew it and so on. But anyway, we survived. Now, what I didn't know then, the male narwhal has a solid ivory tusk about 8 feet long. If I had only thought, I would have offered the native $10 for that ivory tusk and somehow got it into my barracks bag coming home. But you don't think of those things when you're 21. And I understand, well, number one, they're illegal to make commerce with them. And if you could get one, it'd be about $20,000. But the natives would use it for tools and for souvenirs. All right, some views of our station. This is with the midnight sun, June 21st, looking due north, our buildings. In the same spot 6 months later, June 21st, and looking due south, and there's no sun there. The sun was above the horizon for 2 months, May and June and July, and below the horizon and the other end of the year, November, and it would rise again third week in January. Now, the light available at noontime would be about 4 hours a week twilight. And I don't mean like around here, be more like the rear of the room. You could just about read a newspaper at noontime with midnight sun. And then, of course, the days would rapidly change and go back to day and night, but finally getting to 24-hour daylight again. Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis. This is a Army Signal Corps picture, but we were pretty close to the North Magnetic Pole. For any of you that are familiar with boat and navigation, we were about 28 degrees declination from true north. So it's considerable, but that generates the Northern Lights and other reasons. They were spectacular, they were frequent. I saw one cartoon of somebody from the New Yorker of the days, somebody running in with the Northern Lights all over, and he's telling a friend inside, hey, come on out and see the Northern Lights. And he said, I saw them last year. And you get to feel that way. Beautiful greens and reds, curtain-like moving. Wish I had some pictures of them. All right, here's one, the view at summer, and in our station. And from the same spot, that's operations, rec room, and barracks. Same spot, you'll note that the winter time, the snow trails off the roofs, the winds come down from to the right, and teardrop, and it doesn't build up any higher than the obstruction, and this, each building case, the roof. But also we had to shovel out, sometimes from within, sometimes outside, after every storm, and free each building. By the way, I might mention that in September we started to get some high winds, and the snow had not yet built up around the buildings to protect them. And that's when the wind would come in underneath the buildings, and you can picture plywood floors and all. The only thing that held the buildings down was the steel cabling up over the roofs. They couldn't be too tight because they'd snap, and they couldn't be too loose because they'd bounce. So they had to be done just right, and thankfully the engineers did it just right. Okay, we got into winter storms, and frankly this is a pose shot. That's me walking in 40-mile-an-hour winds. And when the winds, we had 5 major blows of 75 miles an hour, sustained, and with gusts up higher. And believe me, when it's at 75 miles an hour, you don't stand straight. And frankly, you better be on your all fours if you're going to be moving at all. And when it gets up to 100 miles an hour, if you're even on all fours, you're not going to be there. You're going to be blown away. And our highest storm, we had gusts up to 120 miles an hour. We don't know how much higher it was because our anemometer blew away, and therefore we never would know how high. But this is the life of the Arctic, and believe me, you don't leave from one building to another except by careful timing in between wind gusts, because you didn't want to get caught in the open, and do your best to get to the other building, wherever you were going. The comfort zone is to stay where you were unless you actually had to get to operations and get the job done next. At the end of the year, my glasses that I wore were absolutely pitted. I could hardly see through them. The blowing snow and all is just like gravel hitting the face, and it felt that way. Okay, the path to the village, from late July through August, before the snow came back. And the reason it was a path is that the moss was worn off, and that's the path. This is the village in summertime. It doesn't look like that now with 550 people. And as my postcard said, Scoresby Sun is no longer quaint. It was a village of 100 people, the church, and the minister's house, the governor's house, a couple of others. All the others were just the sod line shacks that I mentioned to you. Up on the hill was the radio operator house, and that was it. A typical resident house in the village, 10 by 12 feet, and the furniture was one platform, a couple feet off the ground, that served as your chair, a table, or a sleeping level bunk. And the whole family would sleep in the one room, or maybe split between that and the upstairs, which was an attic. They very seldom brought the dogs in because the dogs would get spoiled by being brought inside. So, and the dogs loved being outside, curl their noses into their rears and protect themselves from the snow. And sometimes after a snowstorm, we'd be walking right on the dogs, not knowing that they were there. Oh, by the way, that's a seal drying, and from which they'll be making shoes like I have up here, or jackets. Here's 4 girls from the village. A lot of the clothing was from the same bolts, as they also made their curtains or their other decorations. Notice all the girls are wearing dress kamiks. And here's a picture of my dance partner on Easter Sunday, 1946. And her name was Easter Brennan, so we got known as Easter West. And I might mention that at the dance parties in the village, the 20 to 30 adults would be in the governor's house living room, which was about maybe 12 by 15 feet, not very big, with a wind-up Victrola. That was the records. We would dance polka in circles, maybe 20 people, 20 couples in a circle. And I have to mention this. Fellas, don't get any ideas that this was an idyllic paradise because the governor, who was Greenlandic, there were no Danes in the village then, he said, no carrying on, and you know what I mean. And and we had to abide. And the reason we had to abide is that was our social life. And if we were off limits and doing anything, that would have ended parties. And that was too important for us. Well, two girls in their ceremonial finery, sealskin with colored squares, and if you get a chance afterwards, it's the same material as the color squares here, all handmade, hand sewn. And women, it was their job to prepare the food and the clothing because the men were hopefully out hunting all the time getting food. It was a survival society. And the women would masticate the seal skin in their mouths, and finally, in addition to skin, they would make very fine thread from the seal hide, and that's the way they lived. And by the age of 40, no woman really had any teeth, because they were all ground down, and they were working their gums. Well, the men, on one of our hunting trips, getting ready, the layer system for warmth, wearing their native-style anoraks, and I have one here, and it's made out of bed sheets and with a hood. An anorak means windbreaker, and we still use that term today, and that was about it. The interesting thing, if any of you afterwards come up and feel that, that's the way GI bedding was back in 1945. I can't believe, compared to sheets of the day, that we ever slept on stuff like that. But that's the way it was. Notice the polar bear pants. Great, got a little heavy, but they're the blue jeans of the Arctic. The native cartootie, it's all no screws or bolts because they'd be broken apart on the rough ice. They're all lashed together with seal hide thong, and that's been a traditional style for hundreds of years and still is in use today. The fantail arrangement was used, not like they use in tandem in Alaska, but in the hard-packed snow, the dogs are easier to control. And furthermore, if a polar bear is sighted, the hunter just has to release one knot. The dogs take off and harass the bear. They're trained. And that allows the hunter unobstructed time to get up and kill the bear. If he also happens to kill a couple of his dogs, that's life. He can always get another couple of dogs. But polar bears are very rare. On this one trip up the East Coast, I pointed the cabin. Okay, this is ocean ice, pan ice. And over each and every ice jam, we had a stretch of maybe 10 or 20 miles, which is, about a day's work. We would be lifting the sled with supplies up and over each pan ice, and sometimes the dogs too. It's not exactly the best way to travel, but in those days it was a lot of fun. All right, here's more flat ocean ice, and we're about a half mile offshore here. Notice the mountains coming right down to what would be the water's edge if the ice wasn't there. And this was at midnight in May of '46. For those of you that believe in coffee breaks, this is our coffee break at 2 a.m. in the morning. And we're headed here to the hunter's cabin, like the cabins in the village, 10 feet square, and lined with sod for protection from heavy winds. And there was one reason the natives then, tuberculosis was the normal form of dying, because they didn't live that long, and with the dampness from the sod in the buildings. Since then, they've largely cleaned them out, and they're all wooden buildings now. and so they don't have the TV now that they did then. Okay, airdrops. We had our first drop in early December, which was just 4 months after the ships left. So that's from August when they left, September, October, November, December. The C-47 came and dropped, and then from December until April we had no mail drops. And the reason was we either had to have planes and good weather, both. And they sometimes, if they had good weather, no plane. And also it was a dark period, and pilots just don't like to fly in unfamiliar area to a place where they don't know where to find it. So, and the planes, keep in mind, had to come all the way from southwestern Greenland, BW1, main base, and to get CAVU, Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited, from there up to us, and also over to Reykjavik, Iceland, for emergency landing. It's like having the United States be clear in CAVU from Miami up to Maine, and area-wise, Mississippi over to the East Coast. And it doesn't happen that often in this country. And Arctic weather is certainly a lot unpredictable and all. So they were the conditions. Well, we got the word that one day the radio contact said, tomorrow, weather permitting, plane will drop mail. Well, obviously we got geared for it. And when he radioed that he was over Cape Brewster, the previous slide here, we got out starting to look for him, because we knew where he was, but he didn't. And once we sighted him, we told the radio operator, and by this time the range was line of sight, so voice. So they would tell him, bear left, bear right, you're coming in right to us. And he would fly over and then make his drops. And that's Cape Brewster. So that's the kind of scenery that the pilots would have for about 1,500 miles up the coast. And then leave Cape Brewster and head for us. And it was an exciting time, and we knew what to look for. And they usually drop, here's the C-54. This is the April mail drop. And they tried to drop below 1,000 feet. If the winds were too high, the pilot had a problem, and I don't blame him. Because of the mountains nearby, they didn't want to get caught in the gusts and the crosswinds. But if they dropped any higher than 1,000, and even that's too high, the chutes would end up miles away. When you get a 20 or 30 mile an hour wind, and we had no control on that, we'd be chasing them with the native help of the dog sleds. So one exception to that was the one mail drop of 2 by a B-17. Anybody here a former B-17 pilot? Okay, they loved to live on the edge, as you can appreciate. They were different from the C-54 pilot. And they were dropping a lot of requested weather equipment, and they were using static lines out the bomb bay. And one time, they're dropping what I had requested, radio sonde equipment replacement parts, and the darn cargo platform was on the fjord ice bouncing along, and it hadn't broken clear from the static line yet. So you knew he was under 20 feet off the deck. And I didn't get to use that equipment, obviously. And so finally, and then our operator said, hey, pilot, just so you know, our radio towers are 75 feet high, and there's wires between them, and we knew he wasn't aware of that. So he said, we don't want to pick up any parts here. We have work to do. And the pilot said, thank you very much. So the next time he came in even lower, and he knew when to pull up and ride the tail over. Whatever turns you on, I guess. So anyway, here's some more chutes coming out, and another one, and notice we had native helpers with their dog sleds, and we gave them the cargo chutes because the next week the village women, rather than wear dresses all made from the same flowered designs from the same bolt, they all sported bright red nylon or bright yellow nylon or bright green or blue nylon dresses. So they could jazz up their life a little bit. Last pass were the mail bags. So the pilot would tell us, and the reason we wanted to know that is because we weren't going to be chasing chutes now. We were going to be ducking mail bags because their drop zone was right in the middle of our buildings. And they didn't want to scatter them because actually they didn't want to lose any mail bags, and we didn't either. So a couple of times the fellows got a little nervous, and they got outside the buildings maybe because they wanted to see where that mail bag was coming down from 300 or 400 feet, tumbling over, so they could hopefully get away from it. If you're inside a building and it comes through the roof, you don't even know it's coming. So anyway, that was just the way we saw it. But after the mail dropped, the plane would take off, leave again. And once we got everything collected and inside, we all got our mail, the station became very quiet. As you can appreciate, we were all absorbed in reading our mail from home, either 4 or 6 months late. And the equipment and supplies, they can wait till tomorrow. The mail couldn't. I think I mentioned that total we had 5 mail drops during the whole year. And for various reasons, that's all that they could do for us. Walkboards, starting in May, the fall started, late May. And in the Arctic, the high Arctic, there's no place for the water to go. It doesn't percolate. Remember, it's permafrost, just 2 feet under the surface. So the puddles would form, and that's it. It doesn't drain off. And we had to put some walkboards down, but everything was pretty muddy. But at least we could look forward to the boat coming, we hope, in August. And that's just 2 or 3 more months to go. But at least we were on the upswing of our hoping. Well, I showed you that truck before, and this is what happens in tundra when there's no drainage and the snow is melting. And I honestly don't remember what we ever did with that truck, because I don't see any way that they could have shoveled it out. They, I mean the bigger guys. I just took one picture and I feel I did my job. But yeah, they struggled with it. So from then on through late July, we're waiting for the news of the ship. Some years there was no ice break at all. We were aware of that. And where was it? When's it going to come? And the tension was building, and naturally the tempers sometimes frayed a little. And to give you an example of how desperate you get for amusement, one day Horton, one of our Raywind operators, came out from the radio shack and said, "Hey, this balloon has a slow leak," and naturally we couldn't send it up. So he said, "Why don't we tie," now these are grown men in late 20s, and he was 35, and he said, "Why don't we get a rag, soak it in gasoline, and light a match, and let it go up, and see what happens." So about 3 or 4 of us, sounds good to us. So we all pitched in, and we were doing it right within the building area. And what we didn't count on was the winds suddenly dropped. Instead of going up and going away, dead still. And that balloon went up about 50 feet, and ignited the balloon. And remember the pictures of the Hindenburg? A 5-foot wide balloon of hydrogen looks the same, only you're right in the middle of it. And it came roof. And fortunately, it landed between our barracks and the day room. And we got to thinking about it later. Wouldn't this look good on a statement of charges report that we'd have to buy 2 new buildings or 1 building? So luckily, somebody was with us on that. Well, then to add to our concern, we ran out of coffee, and that's pretty bad, naturally. But worse, in late July then, a radio blackout came on, and this was a biggie. And finally it was we had no news from anybody anywhere. And nothing you could do. And finally one day I happened to be in the operations building getting ready for a balloon run. Our radio operator, he got a little bit more excited than normal. And the message was a Coast Guard icebreaker, the Storis, was at the entrance to Scoresby Sun. And it meant that he was just a half a day away from off-site. So needless to say, none of us slept that night. We're all getting ready for the big day. And the big day, the Coast Guard cutter Storis, the one that had led the way in the year before, there it was. And the work crews immediately started to repair and resupply the station. And after a few days, and the coasties had been ashore, and they, saw the layout. And one of them said to a couple of us up on the deck, because we went on board, and the Danish crew that was relieving us, they already had our bunks and everything. So this coastie said, in the Coast Guard, a lot of us have screwed up, and that's how we got assigned to this North Atlantic run. He said, what on earth did you guys ever do to be here a year? So we said, very proudly, we volunteered. He shook his head and walked off. He must have thought we were real local. But it was volunteer in a sense, and you remember your service days. They assigned us, and I'm serious on this, all we would have had to do was say, I don't want to go. I don't think I can hack that. And we would not have gone. But what would have happened to us afterwards, I don't think we wanted to find out. But it's democracy in action. So the work party got on the beach. That's another use for landing craft infantry as workstations. And on August 8th, about a little over a week, we were on our way to come home. Impatient, of course, but first we had to go 5 days down the coast for the engineers to resupply and repair some of the buildings at a Kangerlussuaq, which is just north of the Arctic Circle. We were in this ice field and pushing each ice pan aside because this icebreaker could not go cut through ice more than 3 feet thick. The bigger ones could, but this one could not. So you go into each pan of ice, move it aside, back up, push another one. So you're zigzagging all the way. There was one episode, one night we were in the bunks and the whole ship was reverberating and went up deck, and we were about 100 yards offshore, which meant the mountain cliffs, and the currents were pushing us ashore. So the captain had no choice but to full power, get out of there as best he could. And he made it by his effort. One day we went about 300 yards. That's about all the progress we could make. Very slow. But we finally got to Kangerlussuaq, and there it is. There were 2 Danes and 2 Greenlanders there. We then went to Iceland for refueling, and one of our observations in an Icelandic fjord, we were wondering why the nearby mountains looked so different. And then it dawned on us, green. We hadn't seen green for a year. It was either white or brown. And green is a beautiful color. Believe me, when you haven't seen it. Well, then the trip across the Atlantic again, and landed in Sarsawak, and we docked about midnight on August the 25th. And nobody was there to meet us. And we said, boy, isn't this something? Here we are, we're given our all for a year, and nobody here given us the keys to the base. But believe me, the next 2 days we were VIPs on that place. We weren't used to saluting officers, and our cook, he walked by and he told a story. Major calls him over, "Hey, soldier." He said, and then he looked at him and he said, "Oh, are you one of the men from Walrus Bay?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Oh, the hell with it." And he walked off. So he knew better. Well, the Army Air Force flew a C-54 up to take us home to Mitchell Field, Long Island. The next day, 2 days later actually, we landed at Mitchell Field. The press, the radio were there, all the papers, New York Times and all the New York papers, and there we are coming down and greeting our men, and we were touted as the last men discharged of the 12 million men in uniform from World War II service. And believe me, it was a red carpet and public display. And the next day, the Major General pinned the Army Commendation ribbon on us. I found out 50 years later that this was not another ribbon. I thought it was, frankly. I found out it's really, if I understand it, the highest ranking non-combat award, and given for meritorious service, staying at your post, all the pizzazz. But the truth of the matter is we did it because we were there. We had to do something. But anyway, the general ended with saying, "Well, gentlemen, you're the last troops out of World War II service. Congratulations. Someday, I'm sure you'll be returning to Greenland." And to which we almost in unison said, "Oh yeah?" Sir. Actually, I think I'm about the only one of our group that ever did return. So we came home and with terminal leave and then discharge. For me, that final day at Fort Dix was the end of October, December rather, and then 46. And we were home, the last men out of the Arctic and out of the service. And by the way, just in case you wonder what dogs sound like in a dog team, either at our place or in the village, I think you get the drift of it. As you know, my wife and I did return to Massilic on the Arctic Circle in August of '86, exactly 40 years after we had left Walrus Bay. And I wrote an article after that called The Last Word, and you're free to take a copy up here. Please do. Then earlier this year, my son asked me, had I ever wanted to return to Walrus Bay? And I said, yeah, but we couldn't get in there back then. And he said, maybe you can now. So I got on the internet, found a tour group out of Iceland, and that's how I ended up. So last month, first 2 weeks in August, I returned to the site. So bear with me. I like to just change the tray here and show you just a couple pictures from last month. It was quite an experience. All right, we of course get in now by air. We didn't have that privilege back then. That's why we were isolated. And flying in from the airstrip about 30 miles away by helicopter, we flew over the site. This is where our weather station had been. And that's the lake where we got water, a creek coming down. I visited on the day before, when we went back to the site, the Danish manned telecommunications and weather station in Scoresby Sund. And the station director got out this weather equipment technician's manual for upper air. This was the book I had used back in 45 and 6. And it's not used, they have new equipment now, but they still have it as a keepsake. Okay, I had an appointment with the mayor of Scoresby Sun the day after I got up there, and I gave him a copy of this book that I prepared that I called The Year, and I also, the last minute, decided, hey, I'm going to give him 11 by 14 photo record of the station. You saw this bigger picture. The crew from the Army Air Forces from the year before us and us. You've seen those pictures. And it's a legacy. And I just felt I wanted to do it for the memory of the men of our station as well as the others, none of whom I knew anymore. And then on Sunday it was raining, not a good day, but we visited the site of our weather station. There's a picture of me getting back into the boat. As you can see, it's a little tricky, but enjoyable. And there I am trying to say, where am I here? Here's our weather station back here. I knew where every building should be. I still had trouble orienting myself. And what threw me off, I was looking for the site of my ray wind mount. What threw me off, I knew that these were the telephone poles, but this is all gravel. Remember that one picture I showed you of all rocks? Hey, what has happened in the 55 years since then, the gravel has either filtered down from the mountains or it's come back from the fjord, I'm not sure which. Okay, one of the buildings, as I said, the Danes vacated this spot in 48. They just knocked them down, plywood and tar paper. And that's the operations building. That's my son standing there. And this is the rec room. I showed you a picture with the, remember the record rack and the checkers game and so on. That was about here. And that's the floor, obviously. And that's the...
May I have your attention, please? The library is closing in 30 minutes. Copiers will be turned off in 15 minutes. Please do all your copying and computer printing now. If you need to apply for a library card, please do so now at the checkout desk. Thank you.
This is our kitchen area. That's the stove. This is what the stove's still there. And by the way, each of the oil stoves, I didn't get a picture of it unfortunately, each of the oil stoves in each building are still there, scattered around, but nobody wanted them. But I've been in touch with the widow of our cook, and I'm promised to send her a picture of this keepsake. Okay, and then Rob and I, my son, he looks down at his feet in the one building and said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, they're weather forms." So a picture, but here they are now in a shadow box. And the interesting thing, they're folded over and all, but they've been there since 48. And nothing deteriorates in the Arctic. So I brought them home in a plastic bag, dried them out, put them in a shadow box. They'll be on the wall. And believe me, it's a funny feeling to be removing an artifact from a historic archaeological site, if you want to call it that, knowing that the artifact is something that I had used once. It sort of dates you. And also makes me very grateful that I was physically able to return to the spot. Gear home I mentioned. Well, when I was there in 45, it looked a little bit more robust. It was in use, but now needs handyman work. And I was told they don't know whether they're going to keep it or not. The floors have holes in them and all. But anyway, 7 bunks. We decided to sleep outside in tents. My son and me. And inside the main room, this is the dining room, if you will. And up here is a notebook. I opened it and read some notes that various men had used, including the present mayor of Scoresby Sun when he was here about 9 years ago. So I made my entry, and let me read it. August 16th, 2002. I am Walt West, here on a visit headed by Ole Brunlund, the Greenlander, and Nani Travel. Kathy and Neville Cartwright, they were the tour directors. I was last here in August 1945 with the United States Army Air Force and 6 Greenlanders from Scoresby Sun. In 1945, the cabin was, quote, newer and strong, quote. Now it needs a little work to restore it to original grandeur. Also with us are my son Rob, Bev Martin, and Rudy and Augie, Ole's sons. We're from, and of course, me from Philly, my son from Seattle, Kathy and Neville are from Scotland, and Bev from Victoria, Australia. Good to see Gearholm and Sid Cap again, just for the record. And also on the one wall opposite there were some sayings. I added mine. Walt West, August 1945 and August 2002. And as I said, it's a funny, humble feeling to be one of the few people in the world that can make a statement like that. Times change. Remember I mentioned dots and dashes, radio blackouts. One night after dinner, Uli, our Greenlander, gets up on the rock and calls his wife back in Scoresby Sun, let him know everything's going well, miss you, honey, and any news from the email, and satellite telephone. Christ, everything's powered in there, and that's it. And that's the way it goes now. And last, on the trip last month, I took 800 pictures, and my finger still wasn't tired. I took 300 film and 500 digital, and I have them in an album now, about 550 of them, and it's just a thrill to be able to go back and see that things have changed, but still, I still feel that I've made closure by going back and recapturing my memories. Thank you very much.
Now, does anyone have any questions for Mr. West? Can you take some?
How did they get the food to us?
Yes.
Well, it was brought in by the ship that took us in. So that was there, and that's the food we had.
And it had to last the whole time?
Frozen. There's no problem with refrigeration. Even the summertime temperatures, we got up to 40.
Did you get mail out of there?
No. Did we get mail out? No. When we were recognized that we were going to be there and no way in or out. Yeah.
We're not going to have a whole lot of time for questions, but if we have questions, let me have them use the mic,
Yeah.
and that way we get it on the tape. We'll have one back here first.
I'll come back to that.
Hello. I just wanted to ask you, being up there in the summertime, did you ever get to see Arctic cotton growing?
Not up there, and I did down in Agmastelik, and I have pictures of it.
Okay. And did you ever have a polar bear come into camp that you had to kill?
No. Now, the reason was that they would come into the village, but the reason they did not come into our camp is we had unusual smells with our non-native clothing.
Okay.
And also the electric generators, the diesels, would wear them away. So the polar bear, one time out on the mount, the Rewan Mount, I did think, heard noises, and McLean came out and said, I brought a couple of rifles, let's wait for it. And what I found out later, I'm glad we didn't spot it, because frankly, I don't think we would have known to hit it in a vital spot.
The reason I asked that, when my husband was up in Tootie, they had one come into camp.
Yeah.
They had to shoot it,
Uh-huh.
and he wanted to take the pelt and the fangs to bring home, and he wasn't allowed to.
No.
They took the bear out and dumped it in the sea.
Mm-hmm.
That was it.
Yeah.
Other, I'll bring them up.
The Bering Sea.
Did you have any medical emergencies? Without a physician, that would be a problem.
Our medic was our medical resource. We had a few burns and injuries, broken bones from sports activities, things like that. Our medic was very good, but if a real emergency, he could have radioed the main base, and what do I do now? He did have to amputate a finger of a native Greenlander, and they radioed up how to do it. It was beyond his initial training. And then the governor gave him a bottle of VO for disinfectant and give to the patient, and also some for Doc, so he could get himself steeled up for it. But that was the limit.
When you were evacuated in 47, I take it the water closed there.
What happened? Well, the Danes relieved us, and they were there for 2 more years, to 48. They then moved the station to a nearby site, but away from Walrus Bay. And that's when they tore the station down. But no, the weather station reporting is still being done. In 1980, then, they moved the weather station into the village of Scoresby Sun at the telecommunications station, which is satellite. So, no, the work continued.
One other question. Why do you say the Danes would feel they'd have to shoot the dogs, those good sled dogs? What was the matter with what the natives would got done to the dogs?
Well, the natives treated the dogs a little differently than we did.
What do you mean by differently?
Well, harshly. They were work dogs, the dogs were there, and the natives just did not feed them or,
And they felt they were so cruel, you'd rather kill the dogs?
well, the Danes did, yeah. But we had no problem because, I can talk to you later about that.
Yeah,
as
I'm
I'm
wondering about
yeah.
Simple question, Walter. What was the language of the natives that surrounded your base?
What was the language?
The language of the people, how did you communicate?
Greenlandic. Greenlandic.
You hear my question?
What is the language?
What was the language of the people that surrounded your base, and how could you communicate with them?
Sign language. A few of us knew basic words, not much. Greenlandic is a very, very difficult language. And we did our best, but you really had to be a verbal audio learner in order to master even beyond the basic words.
And did the Danes own the country there?
Yes.
Okay.
Greenland is a Danish possession. When I was there, it was a territory. Now it is an independent district, and it's home rule, but the Greenlanders run it themselves.